Hello, vinyl community. This is Tommy in North Carolina, and I know it's been a while since I've posted. I believe that since I've last posted, I've got to 100 subscribers. So thank you guys, and continue to like and subscribe and correspond, whatever you feel like. Most of you probably are busy like me during the summer, so record collecting is just one of the many other things that you do. As a matter of fact, I haven't even had a chance to come down here and actually listen to some records in a while. It's been some vacations and just other things going on. But I'm going to spend some time tonight and do some things and also make a video for you guys. This is a topic that's been covered in the vinyl community a few times, and so I want to throw my hat into the ring on this discussion. And these are albums to me that I love, but are generally not as well received, like the critical community or the general fan base of these artists and these albums tend to dismiss these albums. But for me, I really do love these albums, and they're probably some of my favorite by these particular artists. So without further ado, I'm going to get right into it and show these albums to you. The first is the Beach Boys' Love You. Wasn't a critical success, but I think that this album has kind of seen a resurgence in popularity, and particularly amongst Brian Wilson fans. I think a lot of people view this as a Brian Wilson solo album as much as it is a Beach Boys album. This is the follow-up to the 1976 15 Big Ones, which was sort of preceded by this big campaign that Brian was back and that Brian Wilson had overcome his mental state and addictions and was producing and writing with the Beach Boys again. I think some of that was a little bit of a farce, and that album was very mixed as far as how it was received. And then the next one that came out in 77 was this one, which was the Beach Boys' Love You, which was more Brian Wilson than anything than we'd seen probably since Pet Sounds and Smile. And I think the rest of the Beach Boys were kind of sidemen to what Brian was doing here. But it's a strange album. There's some strange songs on here, like Solar System and Ding Dang or whatever, the song that he co-wrote with Roger McGuinn from the Byrds. So there's quite a few songs on here that are kind of confusing to people. But when you kind of let yourself get into it a little bit, you kind of appreciate the quirks and the oddness of it. And it's really a glimpse into Brian Wilson, the artist. And for that reason, this is one of those albums that's kind of on the bottom of a lot of people's catalog favorites, but it's near the top for me. It's one of my favorite Beach Boys albums, and I love it. The next one is by an artist that I love, and it's an album that again is mixed with fans and critics. And when it was released, I can certainly see why it was probably more than confusing. But this is Bob Dylan and his album Self-Portrait. And, historically this album came off this incredible run of 60s albums. I mean, Dylan had gone through the whole folk thing to the electric phase, and then he kind of reinvented himself after the motorcycle accident. And then he kind of came out as more this folksy, kind of troubadour country type thing. And this album is a double album, and it's got some strange covers like The Boxer and things like that, and some odd choices. And this was definitely a step back for Dylan, and I think people were really perplexed by this album when it came out. And so the historical context, yes, I could see where this album was probably a little more than confusing to fans. But now that several years have passed and we're able to look at it on its own, it's a nice set. And even the quirky covers, I enjoy them for what they are. And I think this was Dylan's first sort of statement saying, I don't have to be this brilliant sort of songwriter, poet that people have given me this title of. And these are kind of him doing stuff more for himself. It followed behind Nashville Skyline and kind of had that kind of that same kind of feel. And like I said, it confused a lot of listeners when it was first released, and it was probably seen as the first mistake in Dylan's career. But I can assure you that Bob Dylan has made much, much, much worse albums than this one. And this one on its own today makes for a very pleasant listen and is not as bad as people love to make it out to be. Bob Dylan's Self-Portrait. The next one is Fleetwood Mac. This, you probably know what album I'm going to talk about a little bit. After the success of the self-titled album and then Rumors, they followed it up with this double album, Tusk. And people to this day, I think, argue about the merits of Tusk, whether it's a worthy Fleetwood Mac album. I think the expectations were so high at this point that it was crazy, because, I mean, Rumors was so wildly successful. And this is a strange album. If Rumors was Fleetwood Mac's Pet Sounds, then this is certainly their Smile. It's certainly an album where I think the band kind of gave Lindsey Buckingham more control, and it's very self-indulgent of some of Lindsey Buckingham's whims and practices. The songs are a little more complex and quirky. But on its own, I mean, you know, song for song, I enjoy listening to this album. I'll give you that it's not Rumors. I know that. Rumors is a very solid album. There's a reason why that album is considered to be one of the greatest, and I certainly can see that as well. But this album, I mean, it's to me, I don't know if you would say it's underrated, but it definitely is better than people love to give it credit for. But I mean, it's just a strange set, and it certainly, you know, had big shoes to fill. But I like Tusk. I think it's a fine album. The next one is a Paul McCartney album, and there's a lot of Paul McCartney albums, and I'll probably do a vlog one day on Paul McCartney in particular. But I want to throw this album in there because I think this is one of Paul's underrated sort of gems of the 70s, and McCartney was really spotty in the 70s. McCartney was really spotty after the Beatles, but this is an album that I find myself, I enjoy it. This is the I think it's maybe considered Wings' first album, the band Wings, but it's called Wildlife. Wings Wildlife, I think, is the actual, so I wouldn't even say it's Paul McCartney, it's Wings. But this album has a lot of throwaway stuff like Bip Bop and Mumbo and just some crazy stuff. I love the version that he does of Love is Strange. I think it's a fun version of that song. It's a low-key record. On the heels of Ram, it certainly probably didn't live up to that album. I think it sounds like McCartney kind of working out how to become a band with these other guys, with Denny Lane and to become a band. But I think that it's an incredibly overlooked album, and it's considered to be one of the weakest in the catalog. And again, just like making the Dylan comparison, this album is better than people give it credit for. Maybe that's a better title for this vlog, this video, is that albums that are better than people give them credit for. And I think this album, I'll say I wish I had made this album. If I made an album this good, I would be very pleased. Maybe some of you will think, well, boy, he has really low standards. But Wings Wildlife, I think, is just it's a very good album, and it's very underrated for McCartney standards. The next one is kind of a big deal to me because it's one of my favorite albums of all time. And I always tell people, as a songwriter, I don't know that I would be a songwriter without this album. Close and personal friends like Sean. Hi, Sean. Those types of people know what this album means to me. But in the grand scheme of things, this is a very confusing album for a lot of fans and listeners. This is Pete Townshend's All the Best Cowboys Have Chinese Eyes. This album came after Empty Glass, which is probably Townshend's best known album. It's got Let My Love Open the Door. And this album is a lot of poetry. And Townsend had just finally got clean. He kind of went off the deep end after the death of Keith Moon and kind of had his wild drug years after that, which is strange considering how Keith Moon died and his struggles. And Pete finally, I think, came to grips with a lot of that. And this album is sort of about him reconciling with his wife and coming to grips with middle age and just, being an aging star, which is a subject matter that Pete Townsend certainly has grappled with on several projects. But this album just, there's a lot of beautiful lyrics, but they're very sort of abstract and obtuse. I love it. I love everything about it. The music and the lyrics. It's just an album that I go to frequently, and it's one of my favorite albums of all time. And when I tell people that, I usually have the typical albums like Pet Sounds and stuff by the Beatles and the stuff that generally makes those sort of best lists. But this is one that's easily in my top 5. But it's confusing to people because there's friends of mine that have heard it that said, gee, Tommy, you generally have good taste in music, but this one kind of made me question it. And I'll say this album definitely isn't for everybody, but it's one of my personal favorites. And maybe, part of it's I heard it at a time in my life where it really spoke to me, where the subject matter that Pete was singing about really was very speaking to me on personal and spiritual levels. But this album just, it's one of my very favorite albums. But when you look at lists and you look at Pete Townsend albums, this one is one of those that usually ranks near the bottom or at the very best middle. But it's one of my favorites. The next one is, and the last one is Neil Young, Trans. This album is certainly a controversial one for a lot of fans, and I can understand why. The opening track, Little Thing Called Love, is very Neil Young. It's 80s Neil Young. And this is the album, if you're not familiar with it, this is the album where he introduces us to the vocoder, robot vocals, basically. And from what little bit I know about this, and I'm not like a total Neil Young aficionado. I enjoy Neil Young. I've read Waging Heavy Peace, which is Neil Young, one of Neil Young's autobiographies, but Neil doesn't let you into a lot. But from what I understand, this album was kind of a response to his son, Ben, who was born with cerebral palsy, and this was an album about him trying to communicate with his son, from what I know. Now, if I'm wrong about that, please feel free to correct me down there below, and I'm probably oversimplifying it. But this album causes a lot of controversy in the Neil Young fan base, because it is a hard album to sort of swallow and digest. It's not one of those that you put on and it's Neil Young has a history and during his career of challenging his audiences and following his own sort of creative whims, and that's one of the things that people love about Neil, myself included. And this album was a little more than confusing. I think it came out in '82. It's an early '80s album. I believe it's '82. It certainly was in that early period. But I think it's fun. I enjoy listening to it, and it's kind of one of those albums when I put it on and play it for people, I kind of enjoy the responses that it gets. And so Neil Young, Trans, an album that I personally like. So it's probably not wise to do a video of music that generally people hate and I do like, but I just want to give a little insight into my own tastes and mine. Like I said, I like a lot of great albums, and there's probably, I may do another video at some point about artists that I probably should like but don't know enough about, and there is some of those on there, and we can discuss that. But like and share and post or whatever that you do, subscribe, give me some feedback, let me know what you think, have a discussion. I try to interact with as many people as I can when they comment on my videos, and so please feel free to partake in that, and I would love to have some discussions with you guys. But that's a few albums right there, what I would call albums that are underrated or overlooked or whatever you want to call it, but albums that I personally like and enjoy. I do listen to those albums on a regular basis, and I go back to them and really enjoy them. Follow me on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. It's Tommy Burton 75. I post a lot of what I'm listening to and all that stuff, and you can kind of follow along with what I'm doing there. And again, thanks for watching, Vinyl Community, and I'll see you on the next video, and have a great evening.